I did not expect my own son to turn me into the punchline of his evening, but that is exactly what happened the night Ethan Cole stood on a stage in front of 200 guests and decided to auction me off for $1. I still remember the soft clinking of glasses around the ballroom, the soft gold lighting, and the way conversations faded the moment he made that announcement. I was seated at table 14, hands folded in my lap, doing everything I could to keep my expression steady. Ethan smiled confidently at the microphone, as if humiliating me were nothing more than a harmless joke to warm up the crowd. He called my writing little mystery stories and joked that maybe I would put one of them in a book one day. Not a single person laughed. No one raised a hand to bid. Instead, they looked at me with a mix of pity and unease, unsure whether to look away or pretend they had not heard him. My heart pressed against my ribs with each beat, louder than the music playing in the background. Then a calm voice rose from the back of the room. $1 million. Chairs shifted. Heads turned. For a moment the whole ballroom froze as if the air were locked in place. A man in a dark suit stepped forward with quiet authority, walking down the aisle, as if he had been waiting for precisely this moment. Ethan's confident smile fell apart in seconds. The man introduced himself and revealed something no one in that ballroom expected, least of all my son. He knew exactly who I was. He knew who Marion Cole truly was, even though Ethan seemed to have no idea. And what he said next turned the most humiliating moment of my life into the unexpected beginning of a chapter one never imagined I would live to see. My name is Marion Cole, and for most of my life, I never imagined anything remarkable would happen to me. I grew up in a quiet Arizona town, started working right after high school, and spent more than 3 decades answering phones and filing documents at a small insurance office in Phoenix. People often say that time moves differently when you are busy surviving and looking back. I think that is why the years slipped past me so quietly. I simply did not have the luxury to stop and ask myself what I wanted. My only job was to keep going. I married young. Too young if I am honest. My ex-husband Richard had a way of making his opinions sound like facts. He used to tell me I was not smart enough for college and that I should be grateful for a stable job. After a while I stopped questioning him. When you hear the same message long enough, you start to believe it is the truth. By the time our son Ethan was born, I had already learned how to stay small to avoid conflict. And when Richard left a few years later, I was left with a toddler, a stack of bills, and a kind of silence that only a young single mother understands. Raising Ethan became my life. Every decision, every sacrifice, every late-night shift was for him. I wanted him to have choices I never had. I wanted him to walk into any room and feel like he belonged there. I believed that was what good mothers did. So I worked hard, took overtime whenever it was offered, and tried to give Ethan everything I could. He grew up bright, ambitious, and determined to climb as high as he could. I was proud of that. I still am. But somewhere along the way he started seeing me as someone he had outgrown. The office where I worked did not care much for celebrations, so my retirement party on a quiet Tuesday afternoon was exactly what I expected. A grocery store cake with my name spelled wrong and a few polite handshakes. I smiled through it all. I always smiled. When Ethan texted that he was too busy to come, I told myself it was understandable. He had a demanding job at a finance firm downtown. Important work that mattered. Mine never had. That evening I went home to my small second-floor apartment. It was quiet, as it always was. I made tea and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the dust floating in the sunlight. I looked around at my thrift store couch, my scratched coffee table, and the space that had become more like a waiting room than a home. For the first time in a long while, the silence felt heavy. I wondered whether this was all my life would be from now on. Waiting for a phone call, waiting for someone to need me. On the counter was my old laptop. I had bought it to stay connected with Ethan, but that was only part of the truth. There was something else I had carried inside me since I was a girl. A quiet dream I had pushed aside because someone once told me it was foolish. Writing. When I was 17, my English teacher, Mrs. Franklin, told me I had a voice worth sharing. I held on to those words for years, even when I stopped believing them. That night, after my retirement party, I opened the laptop and stared at the blank document on the screen. My fingers shook as I typed the first sentence, then another. The words were clumsy, awkward, almost embarrassing, but they were mine. For the first time in decades, I was doing something just for me. No deadlines, no expectations, just the sound of keys clicking in a quiet apartment. I did not know it then, but that small moment, alone at my kitchen table, would be the first step on a path that would change my life in ways I could never have imagined. It was the moment I stopped living behind my own shadow and began discovering who Marion Cole truly was. I did not think of myself as a writer. I still do not know if I believed in myself that first week, but each morning I would make coffee, open the laptop, and add a few more lines to the story that had begun taking shape. The words came slowly, like a faucet that had not been turned on in years. Yet the more I wrote, the more something inside me loosened. It was as if I had been holding my breath for decades without realizing it. The story was simple at first: a woman in her 60s who notices details others overlook. A retirement community where things are not as peaceful as they seem. I was writing about someone I wished I could be, someone who moved through the world with clarity and confidence. Her name was Iris Dalton, and through her, I allowed myself to imagine a version of life where age did not make a woman invisible. Iris was sharp, observant, and unafraid. Everything I had never been. 6 months passed this way. Some nights I stayed up typing until my eyes blurred. Some mornings I woke up unsure if the story was worth finishing, but I kept going inch by page by page. When I finally typed the last sentence, I sat back and stared at the document in disbelief. 240 pages. An entire world born from a quiet apartment, and a retired woman who had almost talked herself out of trying. The manuscript sat untouched for 2 weeks before I gathered the courage to research the next steps. I learned about literary agents, query letters, sample pages, and all the unspoken rules of an industry I had never dared to approach. My palms sweated as I wrote my first query letter, rewriting it 3 times before I sent it. Then I created a list of agents who worked with mystery novels. 15 names. 15 strangers who would decide whether this new part of my life had any future. I sent the first email on a Wednesday morning. My hands were shaking so badly that I misspelled my own last name and had to start over. When I finally pressed send, I closed the laptop and walked away, afraid to think about what I had just done. The first rejection arrived 2 weeks later, a polite email saying the project was not the right fit. I read it standing in my kitchen, dish towel still in my hand, and felt a sharp, childish disappointment. Then came another rejection, then another, 10 in total. Each one chipped away at the fragile confidence I had built. One night, after the 10th rejection, I sat at the table with my hands over my face and wondered why I had believed someone like me could ever be taken seriously by the publishing world. Ethan called that same week. I told him about the rejections, hoping he might offer a kind word. Instead, he said it bluntly. "Maybe this is a sign, Mom. You are 62. Publishing wants young voices. Maybe try a hobby club instead of stressing yourself out." His words stung more than the rejections. It was the same tone his father once used, dismissive, certain, final. I almost quit. I opened the manuscript, hovered my cursor over the delete button, and considered erasing everything. It would be easier to let the dream go quietly than to keep facing disappointment. But before I could press delete, an email notification appeared. Full manuscript request. I blinked at the screen, thinking it was a mistake. A small independent publisher wanted to read the entire story. Though my hands trembled, I sent it that night. In the following weeks, I checked my email more often than I want to admit. It felt foolish to hope, yet something inside me refused to let go. And then 8 weeks later, a message arrived, a real contract, a real offer. Someone believed in my writing. Someone who had never met me, who did not know my age or my life story, saw value in my words. For the first time in many years, I felt seen. The contract from the small publisher felt unreal at first. I must have read it a dozen times before I finally picked up a pen and signed it. They planned to print 5,000 copies. 5,000. I could hardly imagine that many people holding something I had written. They also suggested that I consider using a pen name, something many first-time authors do for privacy. I agreed almost immediately. It felt safer that way, especially with how little support I received at home. I spent an evening writing different combinations of names on a notepad before settling on Rose Merritt. It sounded steady, warm, and quietly strong, a version of myself I wanted to grow into. When the first printed copy of my book arrived, my hands shook as I opened the package. I ran my fingers over the cover, over my new name, and felt a thrill I had never experienced before. Iris Dalton, my character, belonged to the world now. The first month was slow. My book's sales rank hovered somewhere in the hundreds of thousands. I checked it far too often. Then one morning a single 5-star review appeared. A reader wrote that she was grateful to finally find a mystery novel starring a woman her age, someone who was not a side character or an afterthought. She thanked me for writing Iris and asked for more books from Rosemary. I read that review again and again, letting her words steady something inside me that had long been fragile. I began writing the second book like someone who had discovered a small flame in a dark room and was determined to protect it. This time the words came easier. Iris had more to say, more puzzles to untangle. I wrote every day, sometimes with excitement, sometimes with fear, but always with a sense of purpose I had never felt at my old job. Meanwhile, Ethan rarely asked about my writing. When I mentioned the contract for the second book, he nodded politely and changed the subject to his latest promotion. His girlfriend Chloe once referred to my novels as charming little stories, the kind retired ladies write for fun. I said nothing, but a quiet hurt settled in my chest. They had no idea how much those stories meant to me, or how hard I had worked for every word. The second book sold better than the first. Then a literary agent from New York reached out. Her name was Sandra Reeves, and she spoke with the kind of clarity that made even my doubts fall silent. She told me my audience was growing, that publishers were finally realizing the power of stories about older women. Sandra believed I could reach national lists with the right support. I felt a rush of emotion hearing someone speak about my work with such conviction. With her guidance, I signed with a larger publisher. They planned to distribute my books to airport bookstores, regional chains, and online retailers with real marketing behind them. I was stunned. All those nights at my small kitchen table were leading me somewhere I had never dared to imagine. But at home, nothing changed. Ethan still referred to my writing as a hobby, and told friends his mother was keeping busy after retirement. It was easier to let him think that than to explain how much my life had shifted. I had built something quietly, steadily, beautifully, and even if he could not see it yet, I knew the truth. I was no longer invisible. I was becoming someone new. The year my fourth book released, everything in my professional life was moving faster than I could have imagined. Interviews, email from readers, meetings with my agent, discussions about foreign rights. For the first time in decades, my days were full of things that belonged entirely to me. That was when Ethan called one afternoon, sounding unusually rushed. He told me his firm was hosting their annual charity gala, the biggest event of his career. The partners were attending, along with influential donors. He said he was overwhelmed, juggling client deadlines and event logistics. Before I could respond, he slipped the request in casually. "Mom, you are home most days. Could you help me organize everything for the gala? Seating charts, vendors, timelines. It would take such a weight off my shoulders." I hesitated. My deadline for Book 5 was approaching, and Sandra had scheduled important calls with producers and international editors. But old habits run deep. For years I had been the one who fixed schedules, managed appointments, and handled tasks no one else had time for. Saying yes felt like the path of least resistance. "Of course, honey. What do you need?" The next 3 weeks became a blur of spreadsheets, phone calls, and errands. I coordinated with florists, updated guest lists, and revised seating plans more times than I could count. Every time I tried to return to my manuscript, my mind buzzed with unfinished tasks for the gala. The story in my head grew quiet, and the blank page stayed blank. One afternoon, while I was reviewing the program timeline, Chloe stopped by unannounced. She watched me juggling phone calls and checking notes and said with a bright smile, "It is sweet how much time you have for this. Not everyone can afford to help like this, since most people have real work." Her tone was light, but her words stung. Real work, as if my novels, the ones readers wrote to me about, were somehow pretend. A few days before the event, I overheard Ethan talking to Chloe in the hallway of the venue. "At least now my mom has something to do. Remember when she had nothing going on?" I froze where I stood, their voices echoing down the corridor. Nothing going on. They did not see the hours I wrote, the contracts I negotiated, the readers I answered. To them, I was just a retired woman keeping busy. That night, I went home exhausted, my manuscript untouched for days. I stared at the laptop screen, feeling the weight of old habits pulling me back into the role I had spent a lifetime trying to grow beyond. I promised myself that after the gala, things would be different. After the gala, I would finally choose myself. I just did not know the gala would become the turning point I never saw coming. The evening of the gala arrived with all the polished glamour Ethan had hoped for. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above the room, the string quartet played gentle music, and guests in tailored suits and elegant gowns moved through the space with cheerful confidence. I had spent nearly every waking hour helping pull this event together, yet when I walked into the ballroom, I did not feel like part of it. I felt like a quiet shadow slipping into the background. Ethan and Chloe stood near the entrance, greeting partners and donors with bright smiles. Ethan looked sharp in his tuxedo, every bit the ambitious professional he wanted to be. When he saw me, he offered a quick hug and whispered, "Everything looks perfect. Thank you, Mom." Then he turned back to his guests. I took a seat at table 14, far from the front, where the leadership of the firm sat comfortably at table 1. Dinner passed in a blur. I picked at my food, too tired and too anxious to enjoy any of it. The months of work had drained me more than I cared to admit. Still, I felt proud that the event went smoothly. Guests laughed, bid generously, and the partner I had heard so much about, Mr. Henderson, looked genuinely pleased. I sat quietly, hands resting on my lap, content just to observe. Then came the auction. A professional auctioneer took the stage, energizing the room with practiced enthusiasm. A set of golf lessons with the CEO sold for $25,000. A luxury weekend at a mountain resort went for $40,000. Each item brought applause and excitement. Ethan stood near the stage, beaming, his confidence growing with each successful bid. And then, with a grin far too wide, he stepped toward the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have one last special item for tonight. A surprise." He looked directly at me before he continued. "I am auctioning off lunch with my mom, starting bid $1. A few people chuckled politely, unsure whether it was meant to be a joke. Others shifted uncomfortably. I felt my breath catch as a ripple of confusion moved through the room. Ethan kept going, even more amused by the attention. "She stays home writing her little mystery stories, so she has plenty of time for a nice lunch. Maybe she will even put you in one of her books." My face grew warm. I sat perfectly still, as if any movement might make the moment worse. No one raised a paddle. No one wanted to participate. The silence grew thick, suffocating. People stole glances at me, their expressions a mixture of pity and discomfort. I had spent weeks helping create this beautiful evening, only to become its closing joke. Ethan's smile began to fade as the silence stretched on. He looked uncertain now, glancing around the room in hopes someone would rescue him with a bid. No one did. Then a steady voice rose from the back of the ballroom. $1 million? The room froze. Conversation stopped mid-sentence. Chairs turned. A man in a dark suit stood with calm confidence, as if this were the most natural thing in the world. He began walking down the aisle, each step slow and deliberate. Ethan looked like the floor had dropped beneath him. The man reached the center of the ballroom, turned to the audience, and said something that changed everything. He said he knew exactly who I was. He introduced himself with a calm authority that seemed to shift the entire atmosphere of the ballroom. "My name is Daniel Hart. I am the head of content development at Silverline Studios." A soft murmur swept across the room. Even I knew the name. Silverline was one of the largest streaming platforms in the country, the kind responsible for some of the most talked about series in recent years. Daniel turned toward me, not toward Ethan, not toward the partners, but directly toward me, as if I were the only person in the room who mattered. "For the past 2 months," he said, "my team and I have been trying to reach the author Rose Merritt. We have been in negotiations for a full-series adaptation of the Iris Dalton mysteries. Our production schedule is time-sensitive, and when her agent mentioned that she was unavailable due to family commitments, I took a calculated guess that led me here tonight." A wave of confusion spread across the audience. People looked at me, then at Ethan and back again. Someone whispered, "Wait, Rose Merritt is here." Another person pulled out their phone, searching frantically. A moment later she gasped, "Her picture matches. It is her." Mr. Henderson, the senior partner, stood slowly, his eyes fixed on me with disbelief. His wife leaned forward, saying she had read all 4 books. I watched recognition ripple across the room like a growing tide. People who had avoided eye contact with me minutes earlier now looked astonished, even eager. Daniel continued, "Miss Cole is the sole rights holder of her work. Without her approval, the entire production stalls. The $1 million bid is simply my way of ensuring we finally get our meeting." A swell of applause rose from the crowd. Some guests even stood, clapping as though a celebrity had just been revealed. Ethan remained frozen beside the stage, pale, stunned, and for the first time in years, utterly speechless. The next morning, my phone was full of missed calls and messages, most from numbers I did not recognize. My agent had called twice. Daniel had sent a follow-up email, Readers somehow found my public contact form and sent kind messages, but the phone stayed silent on the kitchen table as I made coffee. I needed a moment to breathe, to let the chaos of the night settle. At 9 o'clock, the doorbell rang. When I looked through the peephole, I saw Ethan standing there, dressed in jeans and a wrinkled t-shirt instead of the polished suit he wore the night before. His eyes were red, and he looked smaller somehow, like the confident man from the Gala had slipped away overnight. He stepped inside quietly and sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where I had written every chapter of every book. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, with a shaky breath, he began. "Mr. Henderson spoke to me after you left. He said the way I treated you showed poor judgment and worse character." He paused, running a hand through his hair. I thought I was being funny. I thought it was harmless, but it was cruel. "And I am sorry." I watched him struggle with the words, watched the weight of his choices settle on him. This time I did not rush to reassure him. I let him feel it. "I love you, Mom," he said quietly, "but I need to learn to respect you and your work. You are not someone I get to take for granted." His apology was real, but I knew that words alone would not be enough. I told him calmly that things had to change. I had deadlines, I had commitments. My life could not keep shrinking every time he needed something. For the first time, Ethan nodded without arguing. "I will do better. I want to do better." And for the first time I believed he meant it. After Ethan left, the apartment felt unusually quiet. I sat at my desk, opened the manuscript for Book 5, and let my fingers rest on the keys. The night before had changed more than just my career. It shifted something inside me, something that had been waiting far too long to rise to the surface. For years, I tried to make myself small so others could feel large. I stayed silent so others could speak comfortably. But choosing myself did not take anything away from anyone. It simply gave me back the pieces of my life I had set aside. I typed the next line of my story with a steady sense of calm. The chapter flowed differently now. Stronger, clearer, honest. If you have ever been overlooked, dismissed, or made to feel invisible, I hope my story reminds you that your voice matters, your dreams matter, and it is never too late to honor them. If this story resonated with you, please like, share, and leave a comment. I would love to hear your thoughts and experiences. Together we can remind each other that every chapter of life still has room for something extraordinary.